As far back as I can remember, a pickle jar sat on the floor beside the dresser in my parents' bedroom. Whenever Dad got ready for bed, he would always empty his pockets and toss his coins into the jar. Now, as a small boy, I was always fascinated at the sounds the coins made as they were dropped into the jar. They landed with a merry jingle when the jar was almost empty. Then the tones generally muted to a dull thud as the jar was filled. I used to squat on the floor in front of the jar just to admire the copper and silver circles that glistened like a pirate's treasure when the sun poured through the bedroom window. When the jar was filled, Dad would sit at the kitchen table and roll the coins for hours before taking them to the bank. Taking the coins to the bank was always a big production. Stacked neatly in a small cardboard box, the coins were placed between Dad and me on the seat of his old truck. Each and every time, as we drove to the bank, Dad would look at me hopefully and say, "Those coins are going to keep you out of the textile mill, son. You're going to do better than me. This old mill town's not going to hold you back." Also, each and every time as he slid the box of rolled coins across the counter at the bank toward the cashier, he would grin proudly. "These are for my son's college," he'd say. "He'll never work at the mill all his life like me." We would always celebrate each deposit by stopping for an ice cream cone on the way home. I always got chocolate, and Dad got vanilla. When the clerk at the ice cream parlor handed Dad his change, he would show me the few coins nestled in the palm of his hand. And when we got home, we'd start filling the jar again. He'd always drop the first coins into the jar, and as they rattled around with a brief happy jingle, we grinned at each other. "You'll get to college on pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters," he said. "But you'll get there. I'll see to that." No matter how rough things got at home, Dad continued to drop his coins into the jar. Even the summer when Dad got laid off from the mill, and Mama had to serve dried beans several times a week, not a single dime was taken from the jar. To the contrary, as Dad looked across the table at me, pouring ketchup over my beans to make them more palatable, he became more determined than ever to make a way out for me. "When you finish college, son," he told me, his eyes glistening, "you'll never have to eat beans again unless you want to." The years passed, and I finished college and took a job in another town. And once, while visiting my parents, I used the phone in their bedroom and noticed that the pickle jar was gone. It had served its purpose and had been removed. A lump rose in my throat as I stared at the spot beside the dresser where the jar had always stood. My dad was a man of few words. He never lectured me on the values of determination, perseverance, and faith. The pickle jar had taught me all these virtues far more eloquently than the most flowery of words could ever have done. When I married, I told my wife Susan about the significant part the lowly pickle jar had played in my life as a boy. In my mind, it defined more than anything else how much my dad had loved me. The first Christmas after our daughter Jessica was born, We spent the holiday with my parents. After dinner, Mom and Dad sat next to each other on the sofa, taking turns cuddling their first grandchild. Jessica began to whimper softly, so Susan took her from Dad's arms and said she probably just needs changing. So she carried the baby into my parents' bedroom to put a diaper on her. When Susan came back into the living room, there was a strange mist in her eyes. She handed Jessica back to my dad before taking my hand and leading me to the bedroom. "Look," she said softly, her eyes directing me to the spot on the floor beside the dresser. To my amazement, there, as if it had never been removed, stood the old pickle jar. The bottom was already covered with coins. I walked over to the pickle jar, dug down into my pants pocket, and pulled out a fistful of coins. With a gamut of emotions choking me, I dropped the coins into the jar. I looked up and saw that Dad, carrying Jessica, had slipped quietly into the room. Our eyes locked, and I knew he was feeling the same emotions I felt. Neither of us could speak. When Susan and I got home, I found a pickle jar and set it beside our bedroom dresser. Then I dug into my pants pockets and pulled out a few coins. I dropped the coins into the jar, then got into bed and started to go to sleep. Looking up at the picture of my baby daughter on the bedroom dresser, she looked back at me and our eyes locked, and I knew someday, somehow, she'd be going to college. Years later, Jessica and I would take the jar full of coins to the bank and make a deposit toward her college education. And on the way home, we would always celebrate each deposit by stopping for an ice cream cone. I always still got chocolate, but Jessica always got vanilla, just like Dad. When the clerk at the ice cream store handed me his change, I would show Jessica the few coins nestled in the palm of my hand, and when we got home, we'd start filling the jar again. I always let Jessica drop the first coins into the empty pickle jar.